Should I hold it over here? Does that help? Okay. Everybody, if you find something to drink and maybe a cookie or something, and then come and take your seats, we're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you. I may just, yeah, I'm better. Well, that. Okay, I think I'm going to have us get started now. We have a third panelist who's going to be with us tonight. She's coming straight from Topeka, and she's Stephanie Clayton representative. So anyway, we're going to have her go last tonight. But first of all, I want to welcome everybody here to Mainstream in one of our ongoing series of programs that we have every year. And I want to tell you how much we are excited about having these two here with us tonight. I'm Cheryl Spalding, president of Mainstream, and I feel extremely lucky, and I've heard them before. I feel lucky to hear them again because these two are the experts on taxes in the state and what's going on. And so each of you should have a place to ask questions, and if you don't, jot them down. If you don't have them at your place, people will hand out pieces of paper so you can write questions down as we're working, as they're speaking, and feel free to ask them whatever you like. Anyway, let me introduce them. First, there's Annie McKay, and she is the Kansas Center for Economic Growth's executive director. And before joining the center, Annie worked on as a research analyst with the University of Kansas's Institute for Educational Research and Public Service, and with the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. And that's a mouthful to say, and I'm sure it was much even harder to do. Duane Goossen, wow, what a career he's had. He is the Kansas Center for Economic Growth Center's fellow. And before joining the center, Duane was a 7-term member of the Kansas House of Representatives and a budget director for 12 years under 3 different governors. Most recently, he worked as the Vice President for Fiscal and Health Policy at the Kansas Health Institute in Topeka, from which he retired in July of 2014. I will introduce Stephanie Clayton when she comes again, but she sits on the following committees: Social Services Budget, Ag and Natural Resources Budget, and the Fed and State Affairs. So let's go ahead and welcome these two right now.
So thank you all for coming tonight. I recognized several of you before from previous presentations that Duane and I have done, and I have to say that I don't know if you all are starting to treat this like a budget crisis group, support group, but the information I think you'll find is maybe gotten a little bit worse than the last time we might have talked to you all. But we appreciate you coming back together tonight. Just a little bit more about the Kansas Center for Economic Growth for those of you who aren't familiar with our work. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that promotes balanced budget and tax policy. And we've provided for you tonight a copy of our PowerPoints. We can also get it to you electronically if you're interested, but we use our materials to promote balanced and responsible budget and tax policy with policymakers and members of the media and Kansans. And all of our materials, our infographics, our blog posts, and our reports are available on our website. We snatched Duane up in January as our senior fellow, which means that he gets to sort of just roam on and off the reservation. But if you were familiar with his blog post after he left, or when he was with Kansas Health Institute, or after he left, it now is on our website, and he also goes out and does speaking engagements with us. So we're going to start first by giving you sort of a 30,000-foot view of the Kansas budget, what's happened to revenue. We're going to talk the specifics of the tax policy for those of you who aren't familiar with the mechanics of that. And then we're going to look briefly at what some of the outcomes have been. And we'll move through the information pretty quickly because I think we find the value in this in the question and answer. And so we'll give everybody the opportunity to ask those questions. So first, we're going to start with Duane.
Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here with a group of folks who are willing to talk about budget and financial policy on a Thursday night. And thank you very much for your interest in this and your attention to this very important topic for Kansas. Kansas finances are in trouble. And we're going to try to give some brief explanation to that and talk a bit further about what has happened. But to do that, I hope that you will be willing to indulge me in a little bit of budget background for just a couple of minutes, because I think that will help set up the situation that our state faces. Let me see if I have enough microphone cord to. You can stick my chair in just a little bit further. Great. Let's try it this way. Let's do just a bit of budget background, and that will help set up our issue. If you look at everything that Kansas does, the state of Kansas is about a $15 billion a year operation, if you count everything. All the taxes that we pay, tuition that students pay at state universities, fees that we might pay for something, lottery tickets that people buy. If you count it all, it's about $15 billion. Roughly half of that, though, is the state general fund, and another $1.3 billion is the state highway fund. Usually, when we're talking about the state budget, we're talking about the state general fund and maybe the highway fund. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. The state general fund is where most of our taxes go, and that's the fund that lawmakers have the most discretion over. Let's look briefly at where the state general fund gets its money. Here's a graph that tries to divide that up. Note on here that the big two revenue sources are currently sales tax and individual income tax. There are some smaller things, a corporate income tax, a severance tax, some sin taxes on tobacco and liquor, but the big two, sales and individual income tax. Individual income tax as a percentage of the whole is going down. Used to be about half. It is descending. The focus of our state tax policy right now is to take the individual income tax to zero. Annie will say a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. So let's remember sales and individual income tax, and it's important to note here that because of the tax policy that we have in place right now, our revenue is decreasing. So we've got a revenue situation where our income is going down. Now let's look briefly at where the state spends its money from the general fund. Half kindergarten through 12th grade education. Another 20% to pay for the Kansas share of Medicaid. 12% for higher education. 6.7% for other human services in addition to Medicaid. Public safety gets 6%. General government, which is the legislature and the court system, gets about 4%. And then there's a tiny slice in here for some other stuff. But what's important to note here is that if you start here with other human services and go this way through higher ed, Medicaid, and public education, just about 90% of the state general fund is spent out in some way on human services or education. So if something big is happening to the budget, one way or the other, it's going to affect human services and education. Now, also think about this. Look at these items: education, health services. What do you think happens to those costs over time? They go up. Think about it. Think about your own situation, the things that you pay for. Look back 10 years ago. What did we pay for? For housing, for cars, for food, for clothing, for any of our normal items. And then think about what we pay for them today. Those kinds of things just generally increase. And that's certainly true of state government as well. Take just one example, Medicaid. Medicaid costs are basically health services, and they go up every year. The state has very little control over how much they go up. Even as the state has switched its Medicaid program to CanCare, costs have continued to go up each year. That is not abnormal. That's the same thing as happening in every state. It just tracks along with other healthcare cost increases. But it's a cost that the state must plan for. So what we've got here is we've got revenue decreasing and expenses going up. Okay, that's the end of budget background. Now let's put these two things together. Let's put expenses and revenue together. Now, expenses and revenue in Kansas work off of a very simple principle that all of us can understand and that all of us work with in our own personal finances. Expenses and revenue have to balance. Ideally, income would be higher than expenses. It's possible for a short time for income to be lower than expenses if there's some other money to use from the savings account or from some other fund. It's possible to take some money from someplace else, perhaps temporarily in a given year, but ultimately, at the very least, income and revenue have to match. Now let's look at this chart. This chart shows income and revenue. Revenue is the green line and expenses are the red line, and it shows those two things from 2000 on up to where they're expected to go next year and the year after. And if you look at this, I'm not going to take you through the whole history, but you can see there's a recession here that goes clear back to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Income drops, spending has to drop with it. There's a good economic time here. Then you hit a big recession, the Great Recession, where revenue falls for 3 years in a row. Spending had to come down in the down year of that recession. And at this point, right here, in 2010, the legislature expected revenue to continue to drop at the end of as the recession was continuing on, and knew that if revenue fell another year, that spending would have to be cut even more sharply. And after a lot of debate, passed a 1-cent sales tax increase that was supposed to be in place for 3 years. There's year one. In year one, that sales tax increase, along with an economy that started to recover, brought revenue back up. There's year two. But then we get to year three, and even though the sales tax, the 1-cent sales tax is still in place. Actually, it's mostly still in place now. It never was removed as planned. But even though that sales tax is still in place, the big income tax changes start to kick in, revenue falls off, and then in the first full year where the income tax changes are fully implemented, revenue falls sharply. $700 million in 1 year, about 11%, an 11% drop. Kansas never had anything like that. Now, here we are today in 2015, there's 2016 and 2017. This actually shows revenue going up just slightly, or the forecast for revenue to go up just slightly, but this is an old chart now. It's 2 weeks out of date. 2 weeks ago, there was a new revenue estimate done, and now if we draw this green line on here, we just draw it flat. Meanwhile, look at expenses. The budget that the legislature is currently dealing with, even though I would call it a very conservative budget. It's got schools budgeted through a block grant. Lots of programs are cut. There are a lot of different kinds of pullbacks on spending, but still, here's where the budget is that the legislature is currently working with. A very conservative legislature is finding it very difficult to get the budget lower than this point right here. And if you look at this, if you go back clear here to 2008 and draw your line 8 years forward, the budget that the legislature is working with right now is very hardly higher than it was in 2008, even though Medicaid costs have been going up, even though there are more children in public schools, even though there are many other cost increases. The actual spending increase in Kansas has been really quite limited. But this budget right here, the one that the legislature is working with, is about $800 million higher than current income and projected income. We've got expenses that are growing. They're going to continue to grow. And we've got revenue, which has fallen and now is projected to be flat at that level on into the future. So far, the legislature has solved this problem by using up money from the savings account and from transfers from the state highway fund. In fiscal year 2014, that's here, this year is over. The state spent more than it took in. There was money in the bank built up from that 1 cent sales tax. There was money in the bank, and about half of it was spent to close that gap. Now, we're in fiscal year 2015. We're 2 months away, a little less than 2 months away from the end of fiscal year 2015. And this big gap here will be closed by cleaning out the bank account completely and transferring money from the highway fund and transferring money from almost every other fund in state government that has a little money in the balance. So that closes up fiscal year 2015 and leaves the state with almost nothing in the bank or in the balances of other funds. And now the key thing that lawmakers must do is set a budget for fiscal year 2016 and 2017. Part of this gap, this $800 million gap, will almost certainly be closed by drawing more money from the highway fund and from what's left in the balances of other funds. But there's still, even after doing that, there's still a big gap. In order to have a budget that hits here, the state has to raise revenue. There's just no question. The state has to raise revenue. If the state does not, then spending will have to drop down to some level. That's where we are. And now I get to turn over to Annie, and she'll talk a bit about the policy that got us here and what the results have been economically.
So if you're into eating your feelings, I think there's some cookies in the back. This might be a good time to break for that. So it's important to talk about the tax policy changes, and here's why. Because we hear a lot about the tax cuts, but we're not all the way through yet. We did have cuts that started in 2012 and again in 2013, but we're on what we call the glide path to zero, and we still have a very long way to go until we get to zero. If you think back to the slide that Duane showed that represented how much income tax still makes up the state general fund, we're still sitting at 42%. So we have quite a long way to get to zero. But there were two primary components. So it was the individual income tax rate cuts, which is the top part. That's where the rates stair-step down. We started in 2012 where we had 3 income tax brackets. We collapsed the top 2, and then we see the rates decline. There was just another top bracket rate decline starting this year on January 1st, and then that holds flat, and then you can see then another significant drop from 17 to 18 for the top bracket. And then we sit at 2018 at 3.9 and 2.3, but we're not done yet. Once we get to 2018, the rates continue to go down with this really sort of archaic, complicated formula until we get to zero. And then once we get to zero on the individual income tax rate, next up in queue is the corporate income tax rate. So we have a long way to go to see this policy all the way to the end. But just bear in mind that as we talk about this unprecedented revenue loss, it's the beginning of the march to zero. The other big component was the pass-through exemption. A lot more is being discovered about the pass-through exemption at this point. When it was passed in 2012, it was said to benefit 191,000 small businesses. What we know now is that it was actually 330,000 small businesses. That's 140,000 business difference. The other piece, so we were off just a little bit, but then the other piece to that is what's interesting is that in the last 2 weeks, there's actually been more data that's come out that said of those 330,000 small businesses, there were only actually 70,000 of them that have employees. So when we think about this part of the tax plan, it was targeted to be to sort of create jobs in the state. That if we exempted all small business in the state of Kansas from paying income tax, they then would turn around and create jobs. And what we've seen thus far is that it was actually a very small minority of those businesses actually have employees. And then the other piece that was just out today in House Tax Committee was a document that showed that about 60,000 of those small businesses, or excuse me, 60% of those small businesses maxed out from this tax policy at $1,000 break. That $1,000 is not going to be enough to hire an employee. So that was the second part of the tax plan. So 2 major components there. If we had done this and only this, we would have bankrupted the state immediately. this would have blown a gigantic hole in our budget. So we had to have some things that offset it. And Duane referenced this when he talked about the sales tax rate. It was supposed to sunset, it didn't. We kept it at 6.15. That's where it sits right now. We also eliminated some important deductions and credits for low-income, middle-income Kansans. So we got rid of the food sales tax rebate, the refundable portion. Kansas is one of only 4 states that has a sales tax on food and doesn't offer a refund to low-income folks. We also got rid of a property tax credit for renters. We got rid of a child independent care credit that benefited low and middle income folks. The only one we did not get rid of was the earned income tax credit. It was up, and it's up again this session. So you sort of see the theme here in terms of the pay-fors, largely targeting low-income, middle-income folks. Even with all of that, at the time this was estimated by legislative research to bring in $3.7 billion less just through 2018. Again, we're not at zero yet in 2018. What we know now is that price tag was estimated too low because we have a far greater number of businesses that took advantage of the exemption than we originally thought. So when we look at the distribution then of the benefits, just in the first full year, what we see is that the poorest 40% of Kansans actually saw their taxes go up. And it's hard to wrap your head around, how did we cut income taxes but their taxes went up? Well, when you take into account all of the things we did, including raising the sales tax rate, eliminating the credits and deductions, it actually was a net increase for the poorest 40% of Kansans. And we move all the way up the chain, and then we see the top 1% at a benefit averaging around just a little under $20,000. So 2 years later, what do we know in terms of the impacts? We haven't seen an uptick in sales tax collections. So the big part of the income tax rates cuts were, if we left more money in the pockets, Kansans would spend it. But we haven't seen a corresponding trade-off then in increased sales tax collections. Coming out of the recession, we've made cuts to education. We are the only state in the region that has cut back on education while other states are investing in more. And up to this point, what we know is that we have increased classroom sizes, and this is looking at a statewide view, right? So we're not talking just about this part of the state, but we're looking all across the state. We've seen districts reduce or eliminate extracurricular activities. And coming up to this month, what do we know now? That districts are petitioning for emergency funds to make ends meet, to get through just this school year, and that they have less going into the next 2 school years. So this was the reality faced by schools coming into this session. What they now face going into the future certainly is not an opportunity to get back to these investing. The other piece we know is that as we've seen revenue to the state general fund decline, correspondingly we've seen aid to locals go down for things like certainly K through 12, we know that, but also public libraries, county health departments, community corrections. And so as we see that money begin to decline, correspondingly across the state, we see property taxes going up. About 70 counties raised property taxes in the first full year of the tax cuts, predominantly hitting rural counties harder than their urban counterparts. We did see corrections have an increase, but we're still below pre-recession levels. And what this means at the community level or the county level is that Kansas communities are really struggling to invest in the things that keep people there and attract folks in. And while this may not be of grave concern right now to this part of the state, it certainly is as we fan out across the other 104 counties in Kansas. The other piece Duane mentioned, he referenced, was the highway fund. And there's a lot made about the Bank of KDOT and borrowing from the Bank of KDOT. And we released a report recently that looked at the rate at which we're borrowing from the highway fund. And it's not just that we borrow, we don't put it back. We borrow from the highway fund, and then we turn around and issue bonds to plug some of that gap at an interest rate that we have to pay, right? So if we look at what we transferred out in 15, we left less than 50% of the highway fund intact. We taxed Kansas residents in a variety of ways and said, we're collecting this to go to our transportation system. And then we turn around and backed out over 50% of that to go to the state general fund. At this point, it's compromising the health of our highway system. In addition to this, we transfer money out. You can see we transfer over $1 billion out. But on top of that, we have put things on highways payroll, like community mental health grants, K through 12, emergency communications, state house renovation debt. That doesn't show up in the transfers out. That's on highways payroll. So we're actually leaving less than is even shown here. We now have a 10-year transportation plan that is going to extend beyond the 10 years. They're now admitting, well, we're not going to be able to finish the preservation and maintenance projects until after 2020. We are building new things, we are building new bridges, but the roads that lead up to them, we're not maintaining, we're not preserving. It will cost us more in the long run to get the health of our highway system back. And Duane referenced this, but when we look at the whole, there are a lot of numbers that are certainly in play when it comes to the media reporting, the gap that we have to fill. But if we look at this recommended expenditures, and this takes into account the budget that the Senate passed, and just keep in mind, there's not a budget that's passed the legislature yet, but if we look at that, which Duane referenced, very conservative spending estimate, and we look at the revenue estimate that came in, we can see that there's a $1.4 billion gap looking at the next 2 fiscal years. There are a lot of proposals to make transfers out of the highway fund, which would shrink that sum, to pull from early education programs that come out of the key fund, economic development initiative programs, wildlife fees, right? There's a lot of other sweeps which are going to eat into that $1.4 billion remaining balance, but we have a very large gap to fill in the next 2 years. I'm going to leave it at that and turn it over to Representative Clayton, who probably has even better news.
Actually, no, I do not have better news. I came straight from the House floor in Topeka. Representative Ousley is here too. We got here about the same time, so be sure and say hello to him. He's in the back. But thank you all very much for coming here tonight. It's nice to see all of you here. I'm going to go over a section of the budget that has been put separately from what we would refer to as the mega budget, and that is the judicial budget. I'm going to give you just sort of an up to the minute where we are on that and some of the political implications behind it as to why that budget is kept separately from the mega budget. I see a lot of former legislators here, and in their day it was not done that way, but things have changed. It used to be that the judicial budget was included all together, but the climate has, how do I say this diplomatically, become less friendly for the judicial branch in the legislature. That was diplomatic, right? And as such, the judicial budget has been sort of held separately. Right now, we have 2 separate budgets that have been worked or are being worked. The House passed one today that I sort of deem in my head the good, the friendly judicial budget. It doesn't fund it quite as much as we would like. Even when we were discussing it on the floor, there were mentions made that that the funding was still short. We may still be facing furloughs, but that budget has been sent through as a House position and will await conference where it meets with the Senate version of the judicial budget. Now, part of the problem is that in our appropriations bills, we used to have them strictly for appropriations, so strictly for the appropriating of funds. But now we're starting to see a wrapping together of policy with appropriations. And so this makes our debate somewhat difficult on the floor because you don't know if you're debating policy or if you're debating appropriations. And you also have in the Senate version of the judicial budget, and that's House Bill, I think 2005, I left my notes over there, so I may have to correct myself later on, but something that's referred to as a non-severability clause. So what this means is that you have policy pieces wrapped together in that budget, and so if that budget passes, and if the policy is not enacted or fulfilled, then the whole entire thing goes down. So, and that includes the funding. So this can lead to certain huge problems as we look at possibly furloughing judicial staff. And so this is a big concern as we sort of head on. So we have the House position versus the Senate position. We'll see how it ends up coming out in conference. And just to explain things, because obviously, you know, we're not all legislators here. We have a regular bill that can be debated, that can be amended. And then we also have what is called a conference committee report, which is usually combined with the House and Senate positions. Once they're put together, you get an up or down vote. No amending, it's yes or no, and that's pretty much the way that it goes. So this is one thing that I'll be vigilant about as we head on. Many of you, of course, are probably familiar with the judicial selection issues. At this point, now nothing is over until we gavel out, but it would stand to reason that if the votes existed in the House to change judicial selection for Supreme Court justices, then that bill would have been run on the floor. I will say I'm always counting votes on that one, and at least according to my last count, we really don't have the votes to pass that. That requires a constitutional majority. So you have to have a supermajority in order to get that through. But some of you may know that a couple of years ago, they did get 63 votes to change judicial selection for Court of Appeals judges. So you have that. Now they're chosen in a less than transparent way, and then they have Senate confirmation. So you have several different bills that are sort of just waiting there, just kind of hanging out, having passed out of committee. But the way that I see it again is if the votes were there, they would have been run on the full floor. Just letting you know some of the things that we did today. What did we do today on the House floor? Well, let's see. We had sort of an interesting day because we had a bill that lessened the penalties for first and second marijuana offenses, and this is just small amounts of possession. And then some amendments got on that were kind of surprising. One of them was a hemp oil amendment, and hemp oil is not the same as, say, recreational marijuana. It doesn't have that high amount of THC. This is primarily used for seizure medication. And frankly, I was shocked to see the amendment get onto the bill, but it did. And we also had another amendment that came on that was for study of industrial hemp. And you had support from the Chair of Agriculture. House Ag was very supportive of it on the floor. And this is just, things are just kind of moving along. One of the reasons why that agriculturally related industrial hemp bill did as well as it did is because we do have some major water problems in the state. And so they want to work on doing studies, looking at this and seeing if it might be a good cash crop for textile use only, because it might be a low water crop, and we need to start looking and kind of putting that vision ahead. And so that passed overwhelmingly. And so I was really, frankly, shocked to see both of those get onto that bill. So let's see, we did that. The main things that we have coming up, and of course, the biggest concern, as was discussed by Duane and Annie today, would be how do we fund our budget? Now, I do not sit on the House Tax Committee, but I was able to follow along a lot of the proceedings. And one thing that was consistently mentioned today, they had a hearing on a bill that would have changed some of the LLC exemptions. And the testimony was very consistent from the opposition, stating, well, this absolutely cannot be changed, and you just need to wait, and it will work. And that is, I know I see the disbelief, but that is the consistent message that they are bringing forth. It was also mentioned that it doesn't necessarily have to create jobs in order for it to be good for the economy. That's the first time I've heard that argument. But, and as much as we laugh and as much amusement is there, I have grave concerns because as you see the messaging changing, because we remember that first this was mentioned as a shot of adrenaline, then it was wait a while, now it's, oh wait, it doesn't have to create jobs. I'm frightened to hear what they will start saying next. So, but you do have members of the legislature who are much to the right of me, who are not necessarily believing that this is something that works. You've got, and I will never name any names, but you've got a great deal of frustration among a lot of my colleagues in the House because there are certain parties that absolutely will not budge, will not negotiate, will not look at changes to the way that we tax, or in this case, don't tax LLCs. You have a lot of people who have signed that Grover Norquist no tax pledge, and so they're not raising any tax. These are the same people that won't even vote for a fee. No sales tax increase, no cigarette tax increase, alcohol, that sort of thing. On the Senate side, you had the governor's tax bill, which raised taxes on alcohol and on cigarettes, and it was tabled, but then they brought it back to life. And I think that you're going to see a lot of movement on taxation because people are starting to realize that we have to get a balanced budget. One thing that we can't do in Kansas is adjourn without getting all of your money in order. So You know, it's honestly, in my mind, I keep thinking of this line from Paradise Lost, long is the way and hard that out of hell leads up to light. That's the way I think of veto session. And I am hearing that we might be adjourned by maybe the 22nd. I think a lot of people will want to get out prior to Memorial Day. I've been hearing 100 days. It's just, the toughest thing is here is that you have a group of legislators who, no one wants to raise taxes. Honestly, I don't want to do it either. No one wants to have that vote on their record. We're starting to get to the point where we've looked under all of the couch cushions. I sit on 2 budget subcommittees, and trust me, I've looked for money. Everyone has looked for money. People have tried to find ways to say, oh, look, I found it. And then it's like, oh, wait, no, we didn't. So you're starting to see this sort of resistance to making cuts as well, because no one wants to have, Stephanie Clayton voted to cut K-12 education on a postcard. So you're looking at the political realities, because one of the problems here is that if we were simply hired the way that most normal people are for jobs, we could go in there and we could do that. But you have people who have signed tax pledges, who don't want to raise this tax, don't want to raise that tax, and so on and so forth, who have made promises to their constituents, and now we're looking at a point where maybe you shouldn't have made those promises, because the numbers simply show that, as Duane stated earlier, we are either going to have to cut or we're going to have to increase taxes. I could talk a lot longer, but I prefer to use the time to take your questions, because frankly, this is as much for me as it is for you. I want to hear what your concerns are, and I want to hear what you have to say. So thank you for allowing me to speak.
Okay, if you haven't written down some questions and you do have some you want to pass around, just put your hand in the air and someone will come around and pick those up and make sure they get those to me so we can ask these questions. I've got a couple of questions here about capers that I don't know if they want you to guess or if you actually want to know about it. But it says, how's capers funding being treated in the budget? Are they dealing with capers funding, K-12 funding, general funding? How is that being treated in the budget? What are they doing with capers funding?
Every year, Kansas as an employer has to put money into the retirement system. Our retirement system, though, is underfunded. So the state has been on a program of every year putting a little bit more into the system. It's one of the costs that increases every year that the state simply must figure out a way to handle. This year, lawmakers have passed a bill which allows the state to sell bonds in order to help capers. The state will be able, the bill has passed, but the bonds have not been sold yet, but the state will be able to sell $1 billion worth of bonds, which then allows the state to make smaller annual payments into the caper system. It allows the state to, in this next budget year, lower the amount that it puts into capers. But of course, the state has to make payments on the bonds. So there is a trade-off there, but ultimately, the state has to somehow find a way to adequately fund the retirement system, which is whether you sell bonds or whether you don't, there are ever increasing costs that the state has to figure out a way to handle.
Did you want to add anything to that?
I think he pretty well summed it up.
Okay, great. I just got to stop a second. I've seen some former legislators in here, and is Jill over there? Mm-hmm. Jill Quigley was former legislator, so is Ron Morley, and Terry Huntington was a senator. So let's give them applause for Oh, yes, I forgot about you. Yes, and Dolores Furtado. Yes, thank you. And excellent. Thank you guys. Thank you for being here and still being interested. I really appreciate it, and I know others do too. Here's another one. It's talking about the 20 mil state property tax levy in the general fund budget. What are they talking about there, and what's being proposed? My understanding is that they were trying to do away with the
The exemption.
The exemption, yeah, this isn't 20 mils, but they were trying to do away with the property tax exemption. How is that being proposed, and what's the likelihood of that working?
I'll take a try at it. No matter where you live in Kansas, there is a 20 mil levy on your property to pay for education. It used to be that 20 mils was collected locally and given back to the schools wherever it was raised. Now the state brings the proceeds from the 20 mil levy into the state treasury and then sends it back out to schools. The 20 mils raises about maybe a fourth of what it actually costs to run schools in Kansas, and the rest of it is then filled in behind from the state general fund. If you apply that 20 mil levy to more kinds of property, if you can apply it to more things, then it raises up more money. And one of the proposals, or one of the things being talked about during this session, is to make that 20 mil levy apply more on, I guess you just say on houses. It applies on houses now, but there's an exemption.
Right. I would add that first $20,000, if you think about this for low-income folks who own lower sort of end homes, that $20,000 exemption is important to them. So as we continue to look at where we're going to grab money, this is one of a whole list of proposals that are on the table in both the Senate and the House in terms of, there's another bill to raise the 20 mil up to 30 mil. There's a bill to raise the sales tax up to 6.15. And there's no less than a dozen proposals in each chamber that look at, from the business pass-through keys to looking to grab more money from low and middle income folks to plug the hole.
Okay, the next one is about the state, and are they looking at sweeping perhaps the ending balances of the school districts? Has there been any talk about that?
I would not say that there's been any serious talk about that, but please do understand that at this point, everything is still very much up in the air and very on the table.
I might just add that some kind of a balance is important. Very few of us like to operate with our checking account balances at zero. It's important to have something there. The state, by law, is supposed to have a balance equal to 7.5% of what it spends, which in these days, that would be about $500 million. But of course, right now, the state balance is zero. The state has gone through all of its balances, has emptied out its savings account to cover that gap between revenue and expenditures. So the state has no balance. Some school districts, not all, but some school districts have balances. But just because they have a balance, that's actually a prudent financial thing to do, to have some money in reserve in case the state doesn't send money, or in case something happens, or in case an air conditioner goes out or whatever. I mean, there are reasons to keep money in a balance, and it's lawmakers should be very careful before considering that as a way to solve the situation.
Okay, it says regarding LLCs and elimination of income taxes, the reason for elimination was new business development. And other people said, there's another group of questions that talk about, do you understand that your doctors and lawyers and so forth are the LLCs? And do they realize that, and is there a lobbying organization, number one, for that group to make that happen? Is that why that happened? And then the other question is there anybody keeping track of the number of new businesses that were created or coming here, or a number of new jobs created because of the tax break? Is anybody keeping track?
I guess I will speak first to lobbying organizations. I know that, for instance, at the hearing that I spoke of earlier regarding changes to the way that LLCs are taxed, there was a lobbyist from the Society of CPAs speaking against it. So because honestly, you have one CPA, they're not going to create jobs. And I certainly have nothing against CPAs. I sure do like mine. But this is a concern. And this is a loophole that a lot of people were looking to close because honestly, the whole point of this, at least initially, was to create jobs. But one thing I want you all to bear in mind is that I think that this was posed to legislators as vote for this, it will create jobs. But in reality, it had a second intention, and that was to shrink the size of government. That's the original intent. And if we look at the numbers, that's exactly what's probably going to happen.
In terms of the new business creation, there are two reports that you can look at now. They're the annual business formation reports with the Secretary of State's office. And we looked at that report this year and in the past year, and what we saw is that we're actually, the new business creation, which is the net new businesses, we're still running below where we were prior to the recession under different administrations. So we've not seen this act like a shot of adrenaline. I would also say that that new business creation, that's simply people who have filed paperwork with the state. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there are jobs attached to it. At this point, in every committee hearing around the business pass-through piece, there has been no figure given as to the number of jobs attached to that policy. The Department of Revenue, the Department of Labor have indicated that they can't quantify how many of these new businesses have resulted in new jobs. That being said, what I would say is that when we look at private job growth in the state of Kansas, while we had a remarkable February, 1 month does not a trend make. And when we go all the way back to the beginning of the tax cuts of January 2013, we still trail our region, we still trail the national average, and a significant number of the fastest growing private jobs in Kansas are low wage jobs. They're jobs that are going to leave Kansas families living in poverty, not helping them get ahead at the same time where we're really cutting into our social safety net. So these are some of the other trends that the Kansas Center for Economic Growth is tracking as we look ahead to how well is our economy doing. There are a whole host of other indicators that we could talk about, including unemployment, and we'd be happy to do that. But it's also, we've captured it in various blog posts on our website.
Great. Well, the next one has to do with regressive tax policy and so forth, the property tax raise, all the other taxes that have been proposed. If you looked at all of those kinds of regressive taxes, would it close the gap? And someone did their homework out there. I don't know who this was, but you did. Okay. He brought a whole list of taxes that were proposed, and most of them are regressive. And, you know, just hand it over here. Would that, I think most of you have seen it, would that close the gap?
Would regressive tax changes close the gap? Sure. To the degree that you want to, you know, raise your sales tax, you can go a full penny on a sales tax increase, and that's going to generate close to $500 million in revenue. The state doesn't collect property taxes. We talk about that 20 mil levy, but the state's not going to control the property tax piece. But we can make some changes to the sales tax rate. We can make some changes to the exemptions and credits that we still have remaining. and we could close the gap. Currently, Kansas bumped up in the rankings of most regressive tax systems when we made these changes, and we're now in what's known as the terrible 10 when we take everything into consideration. And that doesn't look at what locals are considering in terms of increased property taxes and local sales tax levies on top of that. There was one thing I didn't mention that I just want to sort of jump back to. Kansas wants to be a no-income tax state. There are 9 no-income tax states. They don't do it without revenue. They do it with a whole mix of other things, including sources of revenue that Kansas doesn't have. But here's the kicker. Those 9 no-income tax states also have higher per capita property and or sales tax than Kansas currently does. And where have we headed since we started down this path? A higher sales tax. And what are we talking about now? A higher sales tax. We're talking about making changes to property taxes. And there's this real drive at this moment to talk about consumption, which, by the way, is code for sales tax, but to moving towards a sales tax-based economy. Who else has that? The other 9 no-income tax states. So they do get their revenue, and it's not with lower taxes.
Okay, this one has to do with when we were talking about keeping track of businesses and how many have come in or whatever. This wants to know how many have been dissolved or gone out of business since this new income tax has come into, the lowering of business income tax.
In that formation and report that I mentioned on the Secretary of State's website, you're welcome to email me and I can get it to you because it's really difficult to find. That's why I've saved it to my desktop. But on both of those, you can see the line for the businesses that have dissolved or forfeited. And that's what's pulled the number down. Obviously, we've seen businesses dissolve. I don't have the exact figure. I can get it to you. I think the bottom line is when the dust settles, how many net new businesses do we have at the end of the year? And we actually have seen a decrease. I mean, I think we probably had a number of businesses that took advantage of this and changed their formation, those that could, and not all could. But that may have been some of the switch in terms of new businesses into the state, and we'll probably see that level off some.
This one has asked one of you to explain the local options and how the deficits may impact local commercial, residential, and property taxes. What are our local options in raising those, I suppose, to take care of some of the things we need to take care of?
You know, just to give it sort of a higher level perspective here is one of the problems that you're running into is that you have also an attack on local control and local taxation. Even just a small example of this is in one of our proposed education bills. Do you all remember, I hope that you all voted for this, but the where you had the mail-in ballot for Shawnee Mission schools, right? One of the proposals says that you can only do this during regular election season. So you're already sort of seeing, and that was, I believe that was a very successful ballot initiative, but you see sort of that push for restriction. You see other pushes for restriction, and granted, these haven't passed yet, but the desire is there to prevent local governments and local school boards from raising taxes at all at the local level. So not just what we do, although I do have to say that the state tends to be, and I can say this because I'm a middle child, but we tend to be like the middle children of government. I get mad when my big sister hits me, but then I go and punch my little sister. And that's basically how we are about the federal government and local government. And you really do sort of see this with the taxation issues that you have coming up. So, but do you like to touch on it as well?
That's a good metaphor.
Okay, I'm going to stop for a second and tell a joke that I thought was great. It came from one of the representatives that was recently in Topeka, and told by one of the representatives there, and he said, proposing these new taxes is like fishing with dynamite. Everything comes to the surface, but it's DOA. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask, somebody asked that they had about proposing a tax on utilities. Is there a tax on utilities that's being proposed, and what's the likelihood?
You mean the tax that I got a ton of emails and letters from all of the utility companies asking me to not vote for over the break? That was, I would consider that to be DOA because you have industry against it. And while some of our legislature, God bless us, we will listen to the people, there are some that only listen to industry. And so when you have both of those coming out against it, I would be hard pressed to say that we would see some of that coming. Now, one thing you'll notice too in the rhetoric, and watch for this, is you'll hear them talk about consumption tax and you'll hear the implication that it is voluntary. Now, the last time I checked, especially in this region of the state, nobody's living off the grid. So tell me again how taxing your utilities is voluntary. Tell me again how taxing your food is voluntary, because even if you're growing it all in the garden and only eating those, you still have to buy the seeds and pay for the, and so on and so forth. So there is no real such thing as voluntary consumption, especially not when you're in a state that taxes food and the utilities that you use. So watch for those sorts of things, but I would not see a utilities tax passing.
Stephanie, somebody asked you to clarify what you meant by pulling the judicial budget off by itself. If it's part of the deficit, why is it pulled off? I don't think they understood the political ramifications of what you were saying.
I would be happy to expound upon that. One of the reasons why it is held separately is because some of you may be aware that we have a couple of pending court cases, and there really is sort of this battle between, especially between the legislature and the judiciary, because the legislature, technically we have what we refer to as the power of the purse. Although, bear in mind that if we are not properly funding government, the judiciary does have the authority to, I believe, order us to issue checks. So you have this sort of push and pull, and basically it's a threat. Hey, judiciary, if you rule and tell us that we need to fund schools, then we'll just hurt your funding. So it's a power struggle. I've got a 4-year-old. I know what that's like. I'm not going to say who the 4-year-old is in this case. I think that's heavily implied anyway. But this is why it's being held separately, because otherwise, if it's put in with the rest of the budget, then everyone gets hurt. And so if you pull it out and hold it separate, then you can kind of hold it hostage like that. So that's what's going on with your government that's allegedly being run by adults.
This next question, again, is for you, Stephanie, and it asks about the block grants. It said a couple of the superintendents tend to like the block grants. Dr. Henson does. So can you explain why that may or may not be a good thing for the state?
Well, I am a Shawnee Mission parent. I represent only Shawnee Mission District. So this is one thing that the Shawnee Mission superintendent likes. He's said publicly, I'm sure that you all have seen some of the articles in Prairie Village Post, indicating that if the block grants pass, and I'll go back and talk about what a huge, gigantic if that is, if they're properly funded, I mean, they haven't passed, obviously, then we'll start seeing classroom size reduction, and a big favorite of mine, free all-day kindergarten. I have that aforementioned 4-year-old will be starting kindergarten this fall. I do not qualify for free or reduced lunch, or my kids don't, so I would be paying out of pocket for kindergarten with this child as I did with the first one. So this is something that you look at, especially when I look at with my constituents and think, oh, this would be so great, but the problem is there's no money. So, and we also have the fact that now there have been first day of hearings before a 3-judge panel on school funding took place today. There was no, usually they can live tweet from it, but I could not follow any of it from the floor. It was kind of dark, so I can't even tell you what happened in those hearings because I was at work. But in any case, I am watching this because I have concerns that the block grants might not be ruled legal. So you have this coming up, you have the fact that they might not be fully funded. So it looks good right now if they pass and if there is stability. Another thing to bear in mind too is that that bill was so flawed that there is already a cleanup bill for it. It's been, let's see, we passed it, I think, sometime in March, and already it was that bad that there already has to be a cleanup bill. So, so just keep a watch on this, because they, while they look relatively good for some school districts here, I would say Blue Valley and Shawnee Mission, they look pretty rotten for Olathe and tremendously bad for other schools, school districts across the state. So thinking about the fact that we need to get to 63, 21, and 1, I would not refer to the block grants as stable. So bear that in mind.
I'm going to ask this question of Duane. If we can't get anybody to raise many more taxes besides the cigarette tax or a couple of the sin taxes and so forth, if they had to cut spending out of the budget, you know, the 800 million, what part of that budget would come out of education? How many dollars would, it'd be about half the budget, but how many dollars would that be? And how would that impact the block grant?
Well, you're asking a hypothetical question now that could have several different answers about how this could work. But if revenue isn't raised, then somehow spending will have to come down. One option, and I'm going to talk theoretically here because I don't know what will happen. I honestly do not. I'm not sure that anybody knows how this session will end or what the outcome will be. I think it's very hard to predict. But if the legislature would fail to pass new revenue, but would pass a budget that spends money well above what's received, and they could potentially do that and walk out, then it would fall to the governor. The governor in that kind of a situation would have the power to unilaterally cut the budget in whatever way he saw fit in order to bring spending down to match revenue. He already did that in earlier this year in order to solve some problems that were happening right now in this current year. It wasn't a large cut, but in this, if there's no new revenue, the next cut's going to be huge. That it could happen that way, or another way, the legislature could just simply say, after a period of time, we just can't pass the revenue, so we're going to have to cut spending, and we don't know how to cut spending because we've tried and we can't do it. We can't face up to looking the schools in the eye and saying we're going to cut. We can't look at human service programs and look you right in the eye and say we're going to cut you. So the way to do it would be to say, well, we can't raise enough money to fund this, so we're just going to cut everything a certain percentage across the board, whatever percentage that is. That could sure happen. In which case, if it's a if it's whatever percentage it is, half the money currently being spent out of the state general fund goes to public schools, so half the cut's going to go to public schools in a situation like that. There could be more targeted cuts, but if those were going to come, they would have come already. The legislature's been looking hard. They've been looking every day this whole legislative session trying to figure out ways to cut this budget back. And they can't do it. They cannot do it.
I'm not disputing that.
We've got probably the most conservative legislature we have ever had, and in the face of this big, huge chasm of expenses up here and revenue down here, they can't look these programs directly in the eye and say, we should cut that one, and we should cut that one, and we should cut that one, and thus bring these programs down to the level of revenue. Because we don't have a spending problem, we've got a revenue problem. We have cut revenue in Kansas so low that it doesn't cover even normal, regular expenses. So it's hard for me to believe that any kind of targeted precision cutting is going to happen. If there's going to be cutting, it's going to be either kind of across the board, or it's going to fall to the governor somehow, who knows how he would make those kinds of decisions.
Can I mention the consultant proposal?
We may see a consultant, an outside consultant who is brought in, I think at the cost of, I want to say $3 million. Yes. Yes, $3 million that we do not have at all to pay an outside consultant. I believe that they're supposed to be from North Carolina. I'm hearing the North Carolina Policy Institute, that should cause your ears to prick up. We got one of those here at home, that would come in. And so, but one way to make it a little, to kind of take it off of our hands, and by our, I don't necessarily mean myself, but to say, oh, well, you know, the consultant said that we needed to do this. So that's a passing on of responsibility. Now, I think that one thing that I think a lot of you want from your legislators who are supposed to be balancing your books is to take responsibility and say, all right, we are cutting taxes, and guess what? We are going to cut your government, and stand by it and own it. But yeah, it gets a little scary for people, and so that's where we are right now at this point in time.
I just want to say one more thing about the consultant. If you weren't aware, it was a consultant that got us into this mess. We consulted with Dr. Art Laffer to a much lesser cost. It was $75,000, which looks like a steal. But that was, we consulted for this tax policy. So I think I'd steer clear of consulting.
Can we get our money back?
Can we? I was just going to say that I would love to have that money back. I'd plug it right into the social services budget myself, but too late.
Well, a couple more questions. Number one, considering every month that that's gone by, we've seen the revenue estimates going down, and they project even lower estimates for the next year, and we still manage to get under those. Do you predict that there are going to be more unmet revenue before the end of the year, and if so, will there have to be budget cuts even this year yet?
We don't really want to answer this.
No, I don't. If you remember that red and green line chart in fiscal year 2014, revenue fell very sharply, $700 million. So far this year now, we're 10 months into fiscal year 2015. And so far this year, our income tax collections are running below last year's level for that first 10 months. So we're going to have a really good May and June collection period in order to even just to equal what we got last year. And the forecast is that we'll actually be up above last year a little bit with our income tax collections. So we don't know. I mean, none of us here have the information at this point. There supposedly were still lots of tax returns to be opened in the first week of May. We don't know what the results of that letter opening have been, so we'll see. But whether they are or whether they aren't, whether we meet the estimate or whether we fall below, the big problem is that revenue has dropped, and that whether it's up a little or down a little, it's way below expenses. Whether we make, even if we make the targets, even if we make the revenue estimate, we're practically $800 million below where we ought to be. So we're just way, way, way out of balance. And that's got to be corrected. And there is no hope that we'll bring in enough revenue that this will in some way correct on its own. That's absolutely not going to happen. The state has to raise its revenue somehow It cannot wait and just hope that this will sort of happen on its own, because it will not.
This could be to either one of the three of you. There's a city councilman in the audience who said, I want to know how much city government will be affected. Do we know, and what kinds of ways can city government be affected?
You recall the attitude that I spoke of earlier with the siblings. So first of all, bear in mind that that is the type of respect that is given to local government. You'll see effects coming down, especially, through the judicial budget right away. That's where it goes. It'll hit there. It hits, we hit county government pretty hard when we got rid of the, the mortgage exemption? Yeah. So when we got rid of that, and county government was able to sustain to a certain point. It's going to get worse. Part of the problem is that, and the same thing happens, trickle down is a thing when it comes to cuts, because when we cut our costs, those costs, as you know, start coming down to you. So you might see it in a more nebulous way. You might see it further on down the line, but there's no point in mincing words. It's coming. I apologize.
I would also offer, when we talk about the impact to locals, I referenced a slide earlier in a subsequent report that we released last month, where we looked at the cost to locals of the tax cuts. And we've seen the cost passed on as we've reduced budgets for public libraries and county health departments and all those things I mentioned. And the other part that I didn't talk about was up on the table is a demand transfer that the state has had on the books for a very long time, but has foregone making, the local ad valorem tax reduction fund. Finally, this year we said, well, let's just pull it off, because we've not made that transfer for over 10 years. But there's other ways in which the lack of revenue from the tax cuts is limiting the support that we once gave to cities and counties, and it will not come back. Because we will not have the revenue to pass that money on, because we'll be so focused on just holding the line on K through 12, just holding the line on Medicaid and some of these other things.
My understanding was that the arts probably won't come back, at least anytime soon, and that used to be funded and matched by federal funds as well. I'm going to close now and say, have you join me in saying thank you so much to I appreciate it so much. And before you leave, I want to introduce our Executive Director, Randy Fisher. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you all for coming tonight, for bearing, I don't know if it's raining out right now, but the weather and being here. Thanks to our board and committee members. Thanks to all of you who are members and supporters of Mainstream for being part of our network. We have several elected officials. Many were mentioned. Thanks to the rest of you for running and for representing us. I want to say a special thanks to our two legislators that are here. I'm at a Shawnee Mission School and talked about this event with so many of my peers. And it's so hard to get people with young kids to come on a Thursday night when there's soccer, although I think soccer was canceled tonight. Soccer and basketball and lacrosse. But Representative Owsley and Representative Clayton came straight from the floor of the House. Both have young children at home and were here with us and our active Mainstream members. And I just want to thank you so much for all you're doing. And I was talking with Representative Owsley's wife in the back, and I said, gosh, when you get discouraged, and she said, and it just stuck with me, but I had to write it down because it might not have stuck with me long enough to share it with you. She said, the fight is worth fighting even when we are losing. And that's so true. What we're fighting for is so important. We're fighting for good schools. We're fighting for those who have less. We're fighting for our state and for a really rich tradition that our state has had. And so Mainstream's not giving up. And I know none of you are, because you're here tonight. So with that, I'm going to ask you to do 4 things, but one's optional. So you only really have to leave with 3 to-dos. One is thanks to the 100 of you or so that came tonight. We live streamed this and had others watch around the state. This is part of Mainstream's effort we are now pushing into sort of a statewide presence. We're working with partners, both special interest groups and geographic groups around the state to expand the message. This is part of that. There's a link to watch this later, so share this with your friends. If it wasn't so depressing, I could listen to the three of you talk all night. So I'm gonna have these direct starts here. It's great. Share the link and let others know. I mean, the budget may make some people want to glaze over, but the information is so critical. So share the information tonight with others. That's the first to do. Second, there's going to be some action happening. It could happen in the middle of the night, but Mainstream is going to let you know so that you can be prepared to contact your legislators. We have a push up for those of you on social media or on email, there's a sign up so that we can immediately email you if you want to be informed of when it's time to act. We'll probably be telling everyone. But for those that want to be the first responders, please sign up. If you're not already receiving our emails, and I'm going to assume you all are, do that as well. You can sign up for free on our website. The third thing, we know that the governor doesn't have a mandate. Less than 25% of Kansans voted for this direction. But what's happening is that too many people are sitting out. So Mainstream's #1 goal for the next 2 years, the next 10 years, is to grow the network of informed people in the state, working with others who are doing the same, but we've got to grow the numbers. And to do that, we have an event, we're kicking off a series of lunches, breakfast, maybe happy hours, but that's my preference. But the first one's gonna be on June 10th. So June 10th at Matt Ross, we're having a free fundraising, friend-raising, grow the network lunch to bring more people into the fold. So this is a 1-hour lunch, 12 to 1. You will be out by 1 o'clock to come and find a way that you can connect in with our work. So whether it's just bringing a friend to sign them up to get our email so that they're an informed voter, if it's finding the way that you can fit in to volunteer, or if it's funding this work and making this work possible, we need you to come on June 10th, but I need just a little bit more. What I really need is for each of you to consider hosting a table on that day. There's no cost to host a table. There's no cost to your guests that come. There's no pressure to donate, although there will be a fundraising ask. But what we need you to do is bring 9 of your friends, neighbors, colleagues, or people you think might be with us to that event to come learn more about what's happening in our state and how we're turning it around. So the easiest way to get involved would be to tell me or Lisa or Cheryl or another board member, and if all the board members could stand up quickly, that you're willing to host a table that night. You're willing to engage 9 others in the work. But if you can't do that tonight because you want to beat the rain, expect an email from one of us and we can do this back and forth through multiple emails or phone calls. The last thing is for those that would like to join us and continue this conversation, we always meet across the street at the Tavern for a glass of wine, but that's optional. Come if you'd like, but the first 3 things are not. Mainstream is a coalition of people. So it's not, I sometimes get calls, what's Mainstream going to do? And I put it back, what can we do to redirect the state and return it to Kansas's traditions? Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you all for being here.